Hi, I'm Taryn Almanzar. I'm the Assistant Dean for Admissions and Financial Aid. Thank you. Thank you for taking the time today to participate in this webinar. And thank you for submitting your question as you were registering. They were very relevant, very engaging, and we have used those questions as a roadmap for the next hour or so. Just a reminder that this webinar will not delve into the academic programs in depth. What do I mean by that? We will not be going over the length of the program, the classes, the faculty. That's not what this session is about. We will have future sessions. As a matter of fact, I think we have one coming up next Monday with the Dean of Academic Affairs and the Director of the Stabile program, Sheila Cornell, along with some graduates. And Saturday, October 3rd, we'll have an info session with a few of our faculty members, current students, and the team from career development. We will also not be delving into the admissions process or financial aid. Again, we're going to have a session that focuses just on that. So what is the session about? What is what next hour or so going to be discussed? It's about journalism as a field, as a career. How does the journalism school within Columbia prepares its students and its graduates not only to sustain themselves in this ever evolving and changing world, but also how to be a pioneer and think ahead and see what is coming down the pike. Before I introduce our wonderful panel, I would like to have my colleague, Ross Yelsey, just so you know who he is, since he'll be moderating the chat, and who will be answering some of the questions. Ross?
Hi, everybody. My name is Ross Yelsey. I'm a graduate of the Journalism School. I did the Master of Arts program several years ago, and I'm really happy to be working for the school now. And as Taryn was saying, I'll be monitoring the chat here, and towards around about 15 minutes before the end of the session, we'll be taking some of the best questions, or the questions that are most pertinent to our conversation. I'll be raising those, and we'll have a great discussion based on those. Thank you.
Thank you, Ross. We also have the Dean of our department, Christine Souders, just so you know who she is and that she is here. We also have David Hooker, we have John, and I believe Edwin Isaac also is part of this session. So with that, I would like to turn it over to our panelists. We have fortunate to have with us Steve Coll, who is the Dean of the Journalism School, and Elena Cabral, who is the Director of the MS Part-time program, a graduate, and also a faculty member. Steve and Elena, if you can introduce yourselves, just a little bit about your background as a journalist and what led you to Pulitzer Hall.
Sure, I'll go first. My name is Elena Cabral. I'm the director of the Part-time MS program, which is a program for people who live and work in New York City and want to do the MS degree program, which is exactly the same as the one that takes 10 months, but it is spread out over 2 years or 5 semesters. I am also graduated from the program, as Taryn said. And after working at daily newsrooms at Newsday and the Miami Herald, I returned to New York and to Columbia to teach, and then gradually took on other administrative roles, most recently as the head of communications and of our international programs, which you can learn about on the admissions page. I am also on the faculty, taught many different classes, but I'm also the faculty advisor to the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, which has a student chapter, and it's one of many affinity groups in our school that hopefully you can learn more about. Steve?
Thanks. Hi, everybody. I'm Steve Coll, and this is my 8th year at the Journalism School. Most of my career before that was spent at the Washington Post, where I was for 20 years as a reporter and a foreign correspondent based initially in New Delhi and then in London as an international investigative correspondent. Then I was a senior editor at the paper. Then I moved to the New Yorker to pursue magazine and book writing, which I've been doing for the last 15 plus years, based at the New Yorker. And I teach everything from reporting and writing in our core MS program to seminars about investigative reporting involving intelligence and armies, which is one area of my own work, or did a seminar last spring about covering American politics, which is certainly a lively subject these days. Yeah, love being at the school and working with journalists like yourself. So look forward to your questions and to our discussion.
Thank you, Elena and Steve. Before we get started, I'll just take a step back, and I'm going to let the audience know a little bit about who you are. Two key things. You are from literally all over the world. Some of you are from China, Brazil, Peru, Paris, London, Uganda, Canada, and of course the United States. And I can go on and on. In terms of level of experience and exposure, some of you are still completing your undergrad and you're thinking about journalism school as the next step. Some of you have experience in journalism. You are a full-fledged reporter and you are in the midst of figuring out what is the next step in terms of your career. Some of you are well established in other fields, education, law, medicine, and you're thinking about either switching gears or continue to do what you're doing and be able to report about it. So all of you are very reflective of what the population of the J School. It's the journalism school is one of the smallest schools within the Columbia umbrella, but it's very global in its makeup. I like to call it very New York. I'm a diehard New Yorker, so I said it's very New York in its makeup. I would also encourage you, if you just look through LinkedIn, and you type in Columbia Journalism School, and you're going to see that we are literally all over the world. Our graduates are pioneers, are trailblazing. As a recruiter, one of the great things that I love is when I'm out in a fair and a graduate from 30, 40 years ago comes and approaches the table and says, I'm a graduate of the J School and I'm still here. To those that have recently graduated and are doing great work, I believe Elena is going to have a panel from that will have 3 alums from the program that graduated 3 years ago, and they've already started with a book that is very impactful. So that's just a little bit about yourself. I'll turn it over to Elena and Steve now. But before we start, Elena and Steve, just a few minutes defining this. Because we have this wide range of exposure and experience in our audience, journalism. Very briefly, what is journalism? What do I mean by that? Because of how how easy it is to grab a phone right now and record and put the information as the events are happening, or because we have the internet and social media where people are able to say, this is what's going on, this is what I'm seeing. How is that different from reporting, from being a journalist?
Well, you know, every year we say that it is a great time to become a journalist and to go through this rigorous program, because there's always so much happening in our backyard here in New York City and in the rest of the world. And because of that constant technological innovation that makes it easier than ever and really fun to access information and to present it to consumers in a factual, thoughtful, ethical way. But this year, 2020, and very likely for years to come, the role of journalism is more important than ever in our lifetimes. So many of our applicants, including myself, gravitate to journalism as a way to make a difference, to spur change on a broad scale, more than they could say as individuals in the corporate or nonprofit arena, in courtrooms or even hospitals. You know, they see these amazing platforms, you know, as you mentioned, Taryn, that people carry now around with them 24 hours on their smartphones, and they realize the power that this harnesses to either correct wrongs or to provide sometimes hard truths. And here at Columbia, we use various ways to train students to do this kind of accountability reporting using different platforms. And it's a complex process. The difference, I think, between, you know, bloggers and YouTubers and the, you know, citizen journalists is that this type of storytelling and reporting, it has to be done in combination, you know, with our core curriculum of reporting that's over 100 years old, of reporting and writing, news gathering, ethics, and the law as it pertains to our craft, to make sure that our students rise above the noise of blogs and citizen journals, and that they are bulletproof to, you know, to the extent that they can be in terms of getting the story right. Because as we know, it's very easy now to spread what is broadly known as fake news, but also just, you know, wrong information, you know, that can get picked up and repeated over and over again. Just one of the dangers of this exciting, you know, world of digital platforms that we live in. And I thought it would be really great to give 3 examples of just how we do this type of training, and how in a relatively short period of time, you know, students who are in our 1-year program or 2-year program can very quickly do some very impactful work in a collaborative way, and often across platforms. It used to be you sort of worked in one newsroom, you did one story a day, and, you know, and moved on to the next thing. But the way that journalism is changing now, you know, news organizations and sometimes nonprofit news organizations will partner with each other and bring on a team of young journalists with all of these wonderful data skills and social media reporting skills, investigative skills to do some wonderful work. So the first example, and if you want to share it, you can, Ross, is one that our audio director, Sally Herships, created with the Center for Public Integrity. It's called The Heist. And what it is an investigative series in which a number of our recent grads were enlisted to take a hard look at who really benefited and is benefiting from the Trump Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017. Who were the major players like Steve Mnuchin, and how did those tax cuts come to fruition under the pressure of big donors? So you can see that there's a lot of digging there. There's a lot of data analysis happening there to you know, time these sort of donations along with the various steps that this legislation took to come to fruition. And it's a really absorbing print and audio combination. The Mnuchin episode just came out last night, so it's easy to catch up if you listen to the introduction and the first episode, which focused on those big donors. Study, I think it's really illuminating because it brings, you know, a very focused lens on this one piece of legislation and how it sort of underscores why this country has such a massive gap between the rich and poor. The second
Elena?
example, yeah.
Yes, if I can just take a pause, because you're saying so many critical points about what it is being a journalist, the investigative part of it, the data. Steve, how can somebody or a journalist, as Elena was mentioning, that may be facing pressure from donors, or maybe very conscious of the information that they are putting out there, how do they maintain their objectivity? How do they manage the different pressures, if you will? How do they choose which voice to amplify and how to amplify it?
Well, thank you. I mean, there's a lot in that question. And first, I would say I agree a lot with the way Elena started out characterizing what journalism is and why it matters. I would say that certainly the way we think about it as a faculty, and we're a group, we're a diverse group. And I think that reflects one truth about journalism that's always prevailed, which is that there are many journalisms. There's not only one big capital J journalism. There are lots of interpretations and evolutions, and not just because technology changes and the way we collect information and the way we tell stories changes. There are always active debates about what journalism should be. But I think one reason our school exists, the reason it was created 100 years ago, is because during the 20th century, and by no means only in the United States, but all across the world, increasingly, journalism has evolved into a profession. It is based in the kinds of self-policing, ethical values, and in many cases, legal privileges that you would see in other professions, those associated with law or medicine, counting. And the importance of this is that there is a professional methodology that is associated with excellence, and that is associated with the scientific method, that is facts first, letting the evidence lead you to the truth, recognizing that the truth is always complicated, and that at the same time, there are facts that should be replicable, as the scientists would say. In other words, if you do a scientific experiment and you show a certain result, another scientist should be able to come along and do the same experiment. There's something like that in journalism. If you develop an evidence-based accountability story about the abuse of power, when someone else comes to examine your evidence, it ought to hold up. And that means you need a methodology that delivers strong, transparent work around public issues of the sort that Elena was highlighting. Now, you know, Taryn, you asked the $64,000 question in ethics classes these days, which is about objectivity. What does objectivity mean? And I think it's a really interesting discussion and a complicated one. But I'll tell you my own perspective about it. I don't like that word. I don't think it is very helpful because it's not describing us as human beings. We're not objective. We are the product of our environments, our experiences, and we are loaded with all sorts of preconceived ideas and unconscious biases that are hardwired in us. You know, God made us this way. Survival encouraged us to be this way. And so we're not machines. We don't have objectivity as a switch we can turn on. And so journalism training is not about trying to make you into something that you're not as a person, but it is about teaching a methodology that is linked to the scientific method. And that is, so I think the words that are more helpful than objectivity are, for example, fairness. Mm-hmm. Are you going about your work in a truly fair way? Are you intellectually honest? Are you including all of the facts that are relevant to your story, even if they don't support your thesis? When you're fair, if you're writing something accusatory about someone, are you calling them up, telling them what it is you think you understand and asking them to respond? Is your story complete? Are you leaving out things that a reasonable person would want to know as you put your story together? I think all of that is the kind of professionalism and rigor, you know, really high-level defensible work that sometimes used to get put under the banner of objectivity. I don't know, but in any event, that's what I would prefer to talk about in teaching journalism, because that's where the good work comes from. You know, and finally, I would say, you know, that we styled this conversation around the power of journalism, and I think Elena started down that road, and I'd like to go back to some of these examples because there's so many different ways that journalism is powerful. But I would just say, you know, for those of you who have been in the United States or around the United States or in many other countries, honestly, over the last few years, it doesn't take a lot of work to discover the power of journalism that is distinct from other sources of you know, investigation and accountability in our societies. For example, in international reporting, journalists often set an agenda through their human rights reporting that is very inconvenient to governments. Mm-hmm. And if journalists weren't out, for example, pulling satellite photographs and publishing them around evidence of atrocities, would governments really pay attention to those crimes? Yeah. Probably not. Human rights groups play a role, but journalists can verify and publicize extraordinarily impactfully those kinds of stories. And that's, as a former international journalist, I always thought that was the gold standard for what we did, was to go to the scene of abuses of state power or of mass violence, document what happened, and make the world deal with it. You know, the other thing is that we have in open societies, in our industrialized democracies, we have lots of institutions that are supposed to hold powerful people accountable for abuses of power, but they fail. They don't always work. And in the US, you've seen journalism emerge as a court of last resort around the Me Too movement. The Me Too movement, where women who had sought accountability for abuses of power by men in offices, in media, in Hollywood, they had gone to prosecutors. They'd gotten nowhere. These can be complicated cases, but they picked up the phone, they talked to journalists, journalists did the rigorous work, brought these stories into the public light. There would not have been a prosecution of this, for those of you in America would know about this guy, Larry Nassar, this serial child abuser who used to be the doctor for the US gymnastics team in the Olympics. And he was sent away to prison for decades. And at his sentencing, the judge said, you know, if it weren't for the reporters at the Indianapolis Star, we wouldn't be here today. Because they picked up the phone when those women had tried every other course to tell their stories. And those reporters listened. And then they did the hard work of documenting this so that it could credibly come into the public. So that, I think, is one aspiration that a lot of journalists have when they come into this field, but there's so many other ways to make a difference in the public square. And so maybe I'll just turn it back to Elena to continue with a couple of other examples, because I know they illustrate not just the kind of public interest investigative reporting, but other kinds of reporting, such as we've seen during the pandemic, that is vital to public knowledge and everybody's well-being.
Yes, and you know, when you mentioned Nassar's case, the same thing happened with Jeffrey Epstein's case as well. It was, you know, common knowledge in Palm Beach, and you know, the police officers knew what was happening there, and it really took a Miami Herald reporter, you know, to dig and to convince former police officers, deputy sheriffs, to you know, put aside their cynicism and talk about what really happened there. And as you saw, that turned out to be, you know, after getting a sweetheart deal from a prosecutor, Epstein's undoing when he was finally charged. So that is also a great example of how journalists end up picking up where agencies and watchdog groups fail. The second example I wanted to mention was the Center for Public Integrity, again, with the help of our postgraduate fellows in our Columbia Journalism Investigations program, used crowdsourcing and other techniques to explore how natural disasters fueled by climate change, wildfires, hurricanes, and floods have really created a vast and alarming mental health crisis in this country. The journalists discovered very quickly that the one agency that FEMA has to deal with these catastrophes is woefully unprepared for this mental health crisis. And now we have the pandemic on top of that. And I think most of the stories have come out. But what's interesting about it is that, as I said, you know, journalism is no longer a one-shot hit with, you know, one story or, you know, 2 or 3 stories in a series. These are living, breathing investigations that move and that evolve over time. And so very shortly in October, the Center for Public Integrity plans to have a discussion, which is also open to the public, about solutions, you know, about you know, really looking at and listening to victims of these various disasters, about listening to authorities and advocacy groups about what, you know, are the solutions, before waiting for Congress to pass, you know, any type of relief bill. You know, this group of journalists is trying to find a way to improve the terrible situations that many of these individuals in our country have found themselves. In addition to that, the discussion is very important for our students in the sense that one of the most difficult things we do as journalists is interview or try to find these individuals in the middle of chaotic situations. We put ourselves in danger in doing so. And, you know, there are a lot of pitfalls in doing that kind of work, in which you can hurt yourself and you can hurt the subject that you speak to. We have various faculty members like Judith Matloff, who teaches a class on how to go into danger zones like this one and protect yourselves. But we also have the DART Center and resources like Bruce Shapiro, who really focus on journalists entering these zones and talking to individuals who've experienced trauma and how to do it right without causing more damage. And it's a fascinating field of work. So, you know, when you think about these stories, and how many ways in which they can enrich our industry and make a difference, this is a classic example of one. Next, you know, one of the really fascinating fields of reporting for me is what the New York Times calls a visual investigations team. And if you sort of Google that term with the New York Times, you'll see a number of different stories. But the one that I think is particularly interesting illustrates for me the truth filter through which we as journalists have to put in place when, unfortunately, this president and other groups try to kind of promote falsehoods that spread like wildfire and go viral. It's very sad to see how many Americans can be convinced by, you know, outright absurdities. And so, for example, in the case of Kyle Rittenhouse, the teenage armed vigilante who shot and killed 2 people in a protest in Kenosha, Wisconsin, there was a lot of vastly differing views about him and what happened that night. But this really cool team of reporters, including one of our grads, John Ismay, took a very close look at tracking his movements. He actually did some interviews with some news outlets and others while he was parading around with this rifle, masquerading as a protector and as a medic, you know, all of 17 years old. And while this may seem like an easy process to do, outlining where he was and when, given the volume of social media that was produced that night, it is actually a really complex process of doing this well that involves using online tools for verification. You know, and verification can use everything from the position of the sun at a given moment to street signs and logos and other, you know, minute clues that we don't always look for when we look at photographs or videos, for example, to create an authoritative outline, to cut out and identify quickly the fake stuff, of which there is much to sift through. And to put together, you know, an authoritative timeline that helps give the public a better picture of what happened. And more than anything, allows them to make up their own minds about who Kyle Rittenhouse is and what exactly were his motivations in being there that night. Lastly, following this session, I'll be hosting 2 very recent Stabile investigative program grads who were able to report. This is really cool. I'm biased because I worked at the Miami Herald, but I've never seen a story like this before. And they helped to report and write a very impactful book that is very hard to put down, called The Grifters Club, that takes a very close look at Mar-a-Lago, this luxurious club known as the president's quote unquote winter White House, and where he often conducts state business in an insecure, porous facility with tax dollars that he uses to build the federal government to have a flow of money into his businesses. Just all sorts of questions there about conflicts of interest, and possible violations of federal laws. And one of those students, Sarah Blasky, is a graduate of the class of 2017, which always blows me away because she's so young and so incredibly brilliant and talented, and someone who shows a lot of gratitude about her experience, along with her partner Nick Nahamas of the class of 2014, for what they learned under the tutelage of Sheila Cornell, who runs our Stabile program. And in working at the Miami Herald with some terrific editors who I know and worked with myself, they created this book that focuses just on the money trail, essentially, to a certain extent, which you can follow. People often think of investigative reporting as a paper trail or a data dive, and that you sort of have to have all of this, wonderful mastery of digital tools. But the truth is that what you'll see in this book, and what you'll hear if you attend the talk today, is that investigative reporting is also just about plain old sourcing of people who worked at Mar-a-Lago and no longer work there, people who have surrounded themselves in the orbit of Donald Trump and the Trump family, who have different motivations for being there, and can help recreate moments like when Trump hosted the Japanese Prime Minister Abe at Mar-a-Lago in the middle of a nuclear arms crisis involving North Korea, right in the ballroom where they were having dinner in front of other guests. You may have heard about that episode, but looking at the backstory of what happened is really illuminating. And so what these wonderful reporters do is create this beautiful, sometimes funny, sometimes totally bizarre narrative about what happened that is so South Florida. And one of the things that I learned in journalism in my first reporting class was that there's no such thing as a natural born writer, gifted writer. It's really about what's in your notebook. Have you ever had that moment of writer's block when you're trying to put together a news story and just can't get past a certain point? It was my professor, Sam Friedman, who told me and told the rest of my classmates that that's not writer's block. That means that you need to do more reporting because you're trying to fill a hole, And when you look at this particular book, The Grifters Club, you see in, pages and pages and pages of footnotes that are an interesting read onto themselves, just how carefully sourced every quote and every scene and every piece of data is, that gives it real heft and authority to ultimately give you a view of this president and how he works, who he is, why he's so popular, and how his relationships are formed in a place like Palm Beach. And it touches even upon, Jeffrey Epstein, who allegedly recruited workers, a worker from, at least one worker from Mar-a-Lago, into his trafficking scheme, his sex trafficking scheme. And so for me, because there are so many books about Donald Trump right now, I'm particularly proud that 2 of our very young alumni have produced something this unique, this readable, and this important in the sense that while most people sort of discard Mar-a-Lago as just sort of like a little Shangri-La, a private Shangri-La, it's much more than that. And it's something that you must, that all Americans should care about. And that frankly, you know, authorities should take a closer look at because of the types of activities that these reporters uncovered happening there.
You know, I know we're going to take your questions in just a second, but I think one thing that is embedded in Elena's descriptions is that, you know, for our faculty, no matter where their careers started, whether in broadcast, video journalism, data or computational journalism, or text like the two of us, reporting is what brings everybody together at the school. It is a subject that is teachable, but does need to be taught. It's not easy to learn how to be a full reporter, especially in today's world when so much technology is available to advance your techniques as a reporter. And so that is at the heart of what we do is that reporting. And the one thing that I have loved about teaching is to be reminded of something that I encountered first in a big newsroom like at the Washington Post, which is that the truth about journalism is that you can succeed as a reporter from almost any starting place. You know, this is not a profession that requires you to have Albert Einstein's brain for numbers or abstractions. It's not a profession that requires you to have a surgeon's hands. You, through persistence, through being ethical and determined and independent-minded and maybe good on your feet talking to people, it is definitely a profession for people who don't mind talking to strangers, because that's a lot of the work. But so many people succeed in developing sources, in recognizing stories, and being a reliable witness from such amazingly different starting points. And every time I encounter someone who just stuns me with their effectiveness as a reporter from, you know, the most unlikely path, I'm just reminded of how much I value that about journalism. It is truly an open profession, and you can find your way through it from lots of perspectives. The only last thing I want to say very quickly is the two of us, because that's kind of where we've come from, we've talked a lot about public interest reporting and impact and accountability. And that is a lot of what reporting in the public square brings you toward. But there are so many other ways in which journalism works, and that where we teach. There is literary journalism, where you are learning to work with nonfiction to create powerful literary effects through storytelling, character development, scene, and immersion. There is visual journalism, photojournalism of the highest order, increasingly inseparable from video journalism of the highest order. There's documentary filmmaking, a dedicated program to that, but also the possibility of studying it even if you don't enroll as a specialist. We're in a moment of extraordinary renaissance in documentary filmmaking because of the streaming platforms and other factors. This audio journalism is another renaissance that is overtaking our field in very powerful ways, because it's such a capacious, open space to do really important stories. Elena gave an example, but podcasting is an enormous opportunity for young journalists, and I find increasingly the students who turn up are interested in learning those techniques. You know, our commitment to reporting flows across all of those fields, and the last I'd mention is data journalism, computational journalism. If you want to know what that means, just look at the very best coverage that's come out of the pandemic, where journalists at the Times and the Washington Post and many other organizations have used publicly available epidemiological data to create visualizations and to discover insights that are of real public importance from day to day, tracking what is happening around your community, your county, your city, and also making sense out of the debates and the confusion that our governments sometimes generate when they respond to a crisis of this magnitude. So computational journalism is a strengthening field of increasing relevance. A lot of journalists went into the field because they didn't want to do the math. Now you have a whole world of journalists who are combining computational and computer science fields with the practice of journalism that we've been talking about. And all of that, we have a separate degree program at our school that's devoted to that. But all journalism is increasingly informed by these techniques. So it's a time of real dynamism, as well as a time where we feel very committed to the core public purpose of journalism. So let me stop, and I don't know, Ross, if you're going to throw some questions at us from the group.
Yeah, thank you to everyone who asked some really great questions during the chat. The first I'll start with is for people who are in other countries where potentially the freedom of the press is not a given. What advice do you have for them who are trying to hold governments accountable, but maybe there are going to be consequences potentially for trying to do that where they live?
Yeah, it's a really hard, it's a hard question, and we spend a lot of time teaching journalists who have come to America from such environments and are trying to decide whether or how they can go back. You know, we're very connected to the organizations like the Committee to Protect Journalists based in New York, and Reporters Without Borders based in Europe, that are in touch with journalists who are in danger because of the work they're doing in their countries. Our students often participate in campaigns to win the release of journalists who have been jailed or harassed because of their professional work. And you know, I wish there were an easy answer to the question, what should one do? A lot of journalists bravely and at very high cost choose to stay and continue their work notwithstanding the price they pay. I think in my experience working with such journalists, for example, in South Asia and Pakistan, you know, a typical thing is to try to get out of the country for a cooling off period when you have attracted a certain amount of heat. There are some countries that are difficult to work in as a journalist, but not impossible. So you can kind of step out for 6 months, then go back in, step out. And then there are other places where people just go into exile, and they stay in exile for as long as they need to do it. So these are all familiar, actually concrete stories involving sometimes our own graduates. And it is a reality that authoritarianism is on the rise around the world, and that's a whole nother webinar that I won't go down that road with you now. But it's a time of increasing importance for journalism, but also a time of increasing difficulty.
Thanks. And then we had several questions asking to expand a bit more about the question of what do we do about the wide range of misinformation out there in social media and other places, especially with an election coming up where there may be a lot of competing narratives about, you know, what's going on. How can journalists kind of cut through all of that noise?
Well, I'll take a quick pass at it, and Elena may have some thoughts. She mentioned this earlier. We have we're blessed with one of the world's leading researchers in this field, Emily Bell, who runs a center at our school called the Tao Center for Digital Journalism. And she and colleagues have been documenting the rise of disinformation, particularly on social media platforms, and really through their research primarily, but also through their kind of public pressure that they've been able to put on platforms, they've been able to identify the inadequacy of some of the kind of self-written solutions that big platforms like Facebook and others have continually put forward. It's a very important function of journalism today to hold Silicon Valley platforms accountable. They are almost quasi-governments in the role that they play in our information ecosystem, yet they're privately run. They try to self-regulate in order to preserve their business interests, but they don't often succeed in achieving the goals that they announce. And if it weren't for researchers like Emily, we wouldn't even know the extent of the problem. There is, so I think the best way that journalism can fight disinformation is to document it and to hold the institutions that are carrying such propaganda accountable for their failures. And that is the primary function that our research institutions try to carry out. There are a lot of other ideas out there about educating users of news or trying to use technology to fight technology. But in our experience at the J School, you have the most influence when you can just bring some light into these platforms that generally are closed systems where the public can't see what is really going on. And I see that Elena's posted first draft, which was started by a former Tau deputy director, and is an example of this. Elena?
Yes, and the verification handbook too, which sort of grew out, I believe, out of Tau with Emily, and a wonderful master of this field, Craig Silverman. Anytime he comes to speak at Columbia or at various other functions in which, verification and dealing with misinformation becomes a central topic, I try to attend every time, because he is always discovering new workarounds and new resources online, resources that are free and haven't yet been monetized, because journalists and journalism organizations don't have a lot of money to pay for some of the, fancy, technology. And so these two resources are things that I think that in and of themselves can become useful to working journalists. But they can be overwhelming because there's so many tools here. And I think the best way to learn them, rather than sort of sift through the various trainings, is to incorporate them into real world reporting, which is what we do at the journalism school, and to sort of pick and choose and to learn, a good handful of these skills in order to become an expert in them, depending on what interests you have, subject-wise or topic-wise, issue-wise, and what part of the world you might be working in. Each one of these tools, I think, is very, distinctive. And, I find that students will pick and choose, half a dozen or so that they feel are the most useful in the field that they work, whether it's healthcare or politics. And so I encourage you to glance at them.
Yeah, and these are jobs increasingly anymore in the field of journalism, verification jobs, reporting on misinformation. These are beats in newsrooms anymore. And I remember watching a verification specialist at Reuters who works on photography, and his job was to take photos that emerged out of the Syrian civil war that were being sent out by activists and media associated with different combatants in the war, and try to figure out which ones were fake and which ones were potentially usable. And he sat at a desk all day long. He had his own satellite maps and how the mountains were supposed to look. And he went through for 45 minutes what his job was. And I thought, well, that's a kind of fact checking that is the story of our time, that you really have to be able to develop sophisticated techniques to distinguish what are increasingly sophisticated fakes from information that the public would benefit from seeing that is reliable.
Great. And maybe one last question about, it's a big question, but what can we do to diversify our newsrooms and make them more inclusive, which has been a big question, I think, over the summer and fall.
Well, look, in the United States, which is the professional environment I know best. The largest institutions have failed to build newsrooms that look like America. They've failed, across a long period of time, and despite a great deal of awareness and programs, and so the onus, I think, is on institutions to hire and to recruit. There are other parts of the ecosystem, such as the one you represent, the pipeline, to admit, recruit, train, and send on their way young journalists that reflect the diversity of our country and of the world in every respect. But in the end, it's the power of institutions that have the jobs that, to me, I think is the most frustrating, troubling, and repetitive aspect of this challenge. I do think that this has been a summer of reckoning in journalism in a lot of ways, just as it has been across the country as the United States has confronted race and racism in policing, police violence, and started to ask questions about how these stories are covered, how they're recognized, and also about representation and inclusion in major institutions, including our own. And I hope that this moment of reckoning is sustained, because I've been around enough to worry that these conversations, which are difficult as well as urgent, can fade as people go back away from a crisis to business as usual. We're making commitments at our school to make sure that the opportunities this conversation has presented us are sustained. But I think that journalism is not immune from the institutional failures in the United States that really start with hiring, to me. I don't know, Elena, you've lived this as a member of NAHJ and as part of the Unity effort, and I'm sure at Newsday before you came to the J School. What's your wisdom?
Yeah, in making the decision to come to journalism school, a big driving factor for me was the really sad realization that knocking on the doors of media organizations that I had a long-standing dream to enter on my own was just never going to work. That in addition to the training, in addition to all of the things that we've been talking about that you gain to become a capable reporter, I needed the connections. I needed somebody to help me make the introduction to Newsday, to the New York Times, to the Miami Herald. And as someone who worked for 10 years in career services, or career development, we have a very wonderful, capable team there that is really dedicated to getting to know each of our students, their individual talents, their goals. They, in turn, interview and, doggedly follow media organizations, from legacy companies that all of New York Times, Washington Post, to some really interesting startups that are doing niche work in various fields, like this one startup called the 19th that focuses on women in politics. I thought I had discovered them, and I kicked the URL over to Career Services recently to say, hey, we should invite these people. And as usual, Lauren Mack, the coordinator, said, oh, we're already on that. So they really do cast a very wide net at the industry companies that we are familiar with, and everything in between, to make those introductions vis-a-vis a great number of programming events that invite recruiters to talk one-on-one with students, and of course through our Career Expo, which remains the biggest journalism job fair anywhere. We had to make it a virtual one this past spring, but it still was really successful. And in some ways, a little better than the in-person one for the simple fact that we were able to get recruiters who wouldn't normally jump on a plane to attend the in-person interview, but nevertheless wanted to interview our students. So for me, that meant a lot. But joining and becoming involved in these affinity groups as well was an important part of my journey, both as a student and as an administrator, because what I have found is that these organizations, which represent, both students and working journalists in the field, put a great deal of pressure on newsrooms to reflect the communities they cover. And they work with our students to mentor them, to encourage them through speaking engagements at our school, but also in networking events, to make sure. We also have hired a wonderful former editor from the New York Times to become our Dean of Student Life, who happily knows a lot about this process because he ran an institute and runs an institute, at least until a few days from now, that works specifically with NABJ and NAHJ, the Black and Hispanic journalists organizations, to cultivate talent, to make sure that the Times is aware of students, not just from our school, but from others who are rising stars, who need a little bit of coaching and mentorship, which is, what I could have used coming into this business, and to put them out into the world and watch them. And watch them grow, and then ultimately, hopefully, bring them into the fold. And that's the way it should work. These connections, again, they're not easy to do on your own. But when you come to Columbia, you have a whole team of people that are preparing you, not just to meet these folks, but to make an impression.